on today's World Insight with Tian Wei. With deteriorating China-U.S. relations, will the two sides be on the same page, such as the Korean Peninsula nuclear issue? And Brett Kavanaugh has been sworn in the U.S. Supreme Court. Will this controversial appointment shape the midterm election? Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The program is coming to you live Monday to Friday on CGTN. Top Chinese officials received the U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo in Beijing today. Pompeo's visit came just days after U.S. Vice President Mike Pence gave a strong worded speech which criticized China at an unprecedented level. As Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi pointed out, Secretary Pompeo came to Beijing because China is crucial to the denuclearization process on the Korean Peninsula. It is a testament to the importance of China-U.S. cooperation, which is now under threat.
A meeting of top U.S. and Chinese diplomats got off to a frosty start on Monday. Chinese Politburo member Yang Jiechi and Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi told Pompeo that the Trump administration's actions and allegations against China have cast a shadow on China-U.S. relations. They hope Pompeo's Beijing trip would help steer the direction away from further confrontation.
We definitely need to strengthen cooperation and communication to shoulder the responsibility that has given to us by the international community. Of course, such cooperation would need healthy and stable bilateral ties as the foundation.
China-U.S. ties have been deteriorating on many fronts. The biggest friction remains on trade. Washington has imposed tariffs on a total of $250 billion worth of Chinese imports, and Trump has threatened more. Diplomatic exchanges have also been testy. Foreign Minister Wang told Secretary Pompeo today that the U.S. interfering on matters including Taiwan is harmful, and it should also stop making unfounded accusations regarding China's domestic and foreign policies. Sitting across the table, Pompeo acknowledged the tension.
The issues that you characterized, we have a fundamental disagreement. I look forward to having the opportunity to discuss each of those today because this is an incredibly important relationship.
Pompeo's visit to Beijing concludes his Asia trip, which centers around the denuclearization of the DPRK. In the past few days, the Secretary of State met with the leaders of Japan, North Korea, and South Korea. After meeting with Kim Jong-un on Sunday, Pompeo said that the DPRK chairman had agreed to allow inspectors into a key nuclear testing site that it has supposedly destroyed. It was announced that a second meeting between Chairman Kim and President Trump are in motion, but the place and date have not been set. During Pompeo's June visit, President Xi said that China was willing to maintain a proactive, constructive role in resolving issues on the Korean Peninsula. Regardless of the pace of progress, any concrete plan regarding the DPRK would need China on board.
For more on the latest development of the Korean Peninsula nuclear issue with the bigger context of U.S.-China relations, joining me in Beijing, Zhao Tong, associate at the Carnegie Tsinghua Center for Global Policy. In Boston, U.S., we have Sun-Young Lee, a Kim Koo Korea Foundation Professor of Korean Studies at the Fletcher School, Tufts University. In Washington, D.C., we have Sharon Squassoney, Research Professor at the Institute for International Science and Technology Policy with the Elliott School of International Affairs, George Washington University. I want to welcome to the three of you today. Let me begin by asking you, Professor Squassoney, about the fact that it is very important, as both sides believe, to have China on board to resolve eventually the Korean Peninsula nuclear issue, though with the deteriorating, apparently, bilateral relations. Will this process still work? Professor Squassoney.
Well, that's a great question. I think if you look at the history of, for example, U.S. and Russian relations, we've had a lot of ups and downs, and yet there were always certain objectives that both countries felt very strongly about. So even though we have bad blood in certain areas, For example, the Russians are still cooperating on Iran, certain non-proliferation areas, and I think that the denuclearization of North Korea is one of those areas. Neither side can really afford to alienate the other side entirely, but it'll be a little sensitive, I think, going forward.
A little sensitive is the word that Professor Squassoni, who knows China and the U.S. certainly very well over the years of her research, would use. But Mr. Zhao, what about to the Chinese side? Over the years, we heard the Chinese side talking about the bilateral relations. The other part of it is not necessarily linked to the Korean Peninsula nuclear issue. But obviously, things have been deteriorating when it comes to bilateral relations dramatically over just the past few weeks and months. So, what about that, Mr. Zhao?
I think the U.S.-China, they do share some really important common interests in Korea. Their focus was, later focused on addressing the North Korean nuclear issue cooperatively. But now, as the bilateral rivalry increases dramatically, I do fear that this overall sense of strategic competition will distract their attention. If the two big powers now care more about their narrow geopolitical interests, they care more about how to win in this bilateral competition, the inevitable consequence is they will pay less attention to the principle of non-proliferation, to cooperation in addressing North Korea denuclearization. I do hope that they would avoid looking solely from the prism of narrow geopolitical interest. They avoid caring too much about maintaining their own influence, or to reducing the influence of the other big power in this region.
We have been hearing Professor Sun in Boston at the opening of the talks between the Chinese Foreign Minister and State Councilor Wang Yi and also the Secretary of State Pompeo. Their words to the press certainly already indicated there are huge differences before going into the talks. Of course, the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi wished the other side, the counterpart, to have a successful trip to address some of the issues. But the question is, will bilateral issues take the precedence than the international issue in which the two powers really need to work together on as well? Professor Sun, your judgment here. Professor Lee.
In diplomatic language, the meeting between Secretary Pompeo and his counterparts and colleagues just now, today, was a frank exchange of views. Very testy, things needed to be said, the two sides agreed to disagree, and sensitivity or lack thereof has always marked U.S.-China relations since 1949. Of course, historically, things were a lot worse. The Chinese were calling the Americans wounded tiger in Vietnam and paper tiger. Americans called Chinese red China. The bilateral relationship is so multi-layered and better and more intimate today. I don't think the current round of friction will in any meaningful way derail the relationship. And when it comes to North Korea, there is, of course, a great convergence of interests. And China and the U.S. this year has been sort of playing a game against each other. That is, which side gains, seizes, and holds on to the momentum when it comes to taming or engaging Kim Jong-un. And after Singapore in June, the U.S. surged ahead of China. But I think things have come back to normal. And now, with news of Kim Jong-un perhaps visiting Putin in Russia and perhaps President Xi making his first visit to North Korea as the president, I think China is on firm grounds in regaining that kind of clout, influence over North Korea vis-a-vis the U.S.
One of the things is about what each side will be able to do to persuade, to what extent, about the Korean Peninsula nuclear issue. The other thing that is very important is about the confidence and the certain degree, at least, trust, in order to both sides, U.S. and China, to work together on the Korean Peninsula nuclear issue. Mr. Zhao, with that in mind, we have noticed that the mode of discussion in the U.S. recently regarding the bilateral relations is more about quote-unquote war, for example, or winning the war, such as characterized by the trade war going on between the two countries, rather than anything else. So with the president, the vice president, and also the Pentagon all talking about wars and competitions, will the State Department be able to talk about cooperation?
I think you're exactly right in pointing out the importance of trust building. The reason why China doesn't trust the United States over North Korea was because previously U.S. made a commitment to China that if China helped putting pressure on North Korea, the U.S. would provide a softer trade policy towards China, but that didn't follow through. So China grew, I think, suspicious about the United States, and that doesn't help the trust building. But I think, as you said, if people constantly talking about the big words as war, competition, there's no way we are going to delve deep and find real areas of common interest. What we need is to avoid those general talks at 30,000 feet level. We need to go down deep. Go into the details. We need the professional to talk and to find common interests. So in North Korea, if we go deep, there are many things we can cooperate. We can cooperate in verifying North Korea's declarations, in inspecting their nuclear sites, missile sites. So avoiding, pointing finger at the political level, I think is key to avoid the distrust from further growing.
Professor Squassoni, I have to come back to you about that too. The same question, when almost everybody within this so-called structure of the Trump administration talking about competition and wars against China, will the State Department take a different tone and a different road? Meanwhile, to what extent, under that circumstances, will Secretary Pompeo be able to push his Chinese counterpart to work together on some of the issues of common concern?
Well, I think the Trump administration is guilty of a lot of strongly worded statements, just since President Trump has been elected. I think the trick for the bureaucracy, and the State Department is part of that bureaucracy, is to really keep, as Zhao Tong has said, the experts' relationships and their work moving forward. I think Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, is very committed to finding a solution on North Korea. I think the appointment of Steve Biegun is a positive thing. He's not a guy who has a lot of deep background in this area. Certainly when he meets with Vice Foreign Minister Choi Sun-hui, she's got a lot more experience on this topic than he does. But it will be a struggle. No doubt about it. But those, the question is whether there are really experts left in the U.S. government to work these issues.
Right.
But I think it seems to be a high priority for Pompeo.
I see. Since Professor Squassoni, you mentioned the name of Mr. Biegun, then we have to talk about that, isn't it, Professor Lee? I mean, the special envoy on the DPRK has invited, according to him, his DPRK counterpart to have talks. But the question is, even at this working level, what kind of content should be included in the talk so that both sides will feel the momentum? Now I'm talking about the DPRK and the U.S. to move forward.
The U.S. Special Representative for North Korea policy was created by President Obama soon after his inauguration in 2009. That position, of course, the person who occupies that post is the key man, the point man on North Korea policy. However, it is not a top-level position. It is lower than that of an Assistant Secretary of State. And when Secretary Pompeo a couple of weeks ago very publicly called for a meeting between Mr. Began and his counterpart, North Korean counterpart. What did North Korea do? North Korea completely ignored that, and Ms. Choi Son-hee, recently visited Moscow and Beijing while Pompeo and Began were scheduled to visit North Korea. So that shows you how deft North Korea is at playing hard to get, and by merely waving, dangling the possibility of a follow-up summit between Kim and Trump, North Korea is maintaining that momentum. North Korea's concession, so-called, the impression of concession with respect to the Punggye-ri, the nuclear testing site, we know that North Korea has already conducted 6 underground nuclear tests and therefore has no need to conduct another test.
All right.
Both India and Pakistan each have conducted 6 nuclear tests, and the last time they did it was 20 years ago. That does not necessarily mean that they are a non-nuclear power. So I think North Korea is really winning every single round this year when it comes to negotiations with the United States.
All right. Well, it is no secret, Professor Lee, since our working relationship, but that you are not necessarily positive on the development from the DPRK side. But having said that, whether your judgment is right or not, we have to take a look at the timeline. At the Trump-Kim summit in June, Kim promised the complete denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. Prior to the summit, Pyongyang dismantled the Punggye-ri nuclear test site on May the 24th. On July the 23rd, Pyongyang began dismantling its main missile engine test site at Sohae. Today, the U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said it is the U.S. side who said that Kim agreed to allow inspectors into the facility to verify its dismantlement. Professor Squassoni, as your colleague might be a little bit pessimistic about any discussion between the special envoy and his counterpart in DPRK, what do you think should be included in that talk, if that talk really takes place?
You know, the agenda is going to be as narrow or as broad as the parties want it to be. Kim Jong-un has taken some steps which are helpful, because we are a long way away from last year or the year before, where Kim and Trump were simply trading insults at each other. So, you know, I don't want to take away from North Korea. They've done certain things. We have had, you know, face-to-face meetings. However, in the grand scheme of denuclearization, blowing up a test site is virtually meaningless. The steps that you would have to take to really verify denuclearization are quite complicated. They are very technical. They will have to have international inspectors, not just U.S., not just South Korean. And that's just from the U.S. side, right? So from North Korea's side, they're looking for not just denuclearization of themselves, but of the Korean Peninsula. So there are broader security issues that have to do with troops, exercises, and so this is a very delicate and complicated negotiation. So, you know, you don't want to overwhelm it by putting everything on the agenda, but my guess is that there will be certain things like an end-of-war declaration and some compromises on either exercises or troops, and in exchange for some real actions. And you know, one positive thing North Korea could do would be to sign the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty and ratify it and allow CTBT inspectors, international inspectors, in. Does that make me sleep better at night? Not necessarily. You have to look at missiles, warheads, fissile material, well, the whole array. So we'll start slowly. You have to start slowly.
Professor Squassoni, I want to ask a follow-up before I go to the Chinese counterpart about the question. That is, we all understand in a negotiation, one party would like to push as much as they can, particularly with the Trump administration. But the question is, many of the things you just mentioned that the U.S. could do, will they be done? Particularly if it can be done, not before the midterm election, but after the midterm election, which is after this big political show of the Trump administration. What do you think, Professor Squassoni, briefly from your side?
Well, I hope the midterm elections personally are a huge upset for the Republicans, but that aside, I don't think they're going to affect negotiations on North Korea. I think there's strong bipartisan support for finding a solution on the Korean Peninsula. I think where you might see some criticism of Trump is if things go very quickly and the gains are not very substantial. So in other words, if there's another summit and there's a lot of, you know, nice language about, you know, Chairman Kim, and yet he's not really denuclearizing, there you might see a little bit of criticism. But I think this goal is really important across the political spectrum in the U.S.
I see. How much of a political issue will it be, Professor Lee, from your perspective, leading up to the midterm election? Will this issue really see further light in the tunnel, in a way, even after the midterm, from the U.S. side, for example?
Well, foreign policy, of course, is an extension of domestic political considerations, and President Trump will declare victory no matter what in having had another meeting with Kim Jong-un and having tamed him, conditioned him to give up his nukes. There are political gains for both sides, but I think Kim Jong-un's gains are far greater because if the U.S. agrees to a peace declaration or an end-of-war declaration, which sounds very soothing, that will really compel the U.S. into sort of self-deterrence. How can the U.S. even return to rhetorical bellicosity, sanctions enforcement, or even defensive military drills with South Korea when the U.S. has signed up for peace? And I think the U.S. is on the verge of doing that. So whatever President Trump declares, he will sell it. He will sell his next meeting or round of agreement negotiation with North Korea as a victory, and thereby it will be increasingly more difficult for Trump to admit having been duped or having made a mistake and walk away from that agreement that he himself has signed.
Well, before we go, I want to go to you, Mr. Zhao. What does it mean for the other parties? I mean, you got a DPRK, you got the U.S. directly involved, but the other factors becoming ever more complicated. China's involvement, South Korea's role, what Japan will do, and Russia will be active. What does it all mean eventually if we ever see any solution or possibility of any solution?
I think we want to decide on, who should play the most important role according to what task we are working on. For now, the next step is to negotiate a political declaration of the end of war. So the most relevant party are apparently two Koreas, China, and United States. So I don't think it would make sense to broaden the dialogue too much to formally invite Russia or even Japan to participate. Too many cooks will, make it, even more difficult to make a deal, make a meal. So, but if we move on to negotiate a peace treaty, then I think it would be beneficial to consult Russia and Japan, because the peace treaty will influence, in a very significant manner, their security interests. So I think we can work towards something in the form of six-party talks to give every relevant party a seat at the table.
Right.
But at this moment, I think we should focus on the most relevant parties to resolve the most immediate task.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's such a pleasure to have all of you joining me on this discussion, even though I heard quite a number of sighs before you try to answer the questions. But thank you so much for your constructive contribution and insights on the way forward. Really appreciate it. Zhao Tong, Sun-Yong Lee, Sharon Squasson Lee. Really appreciate it. Thank you so much. Stay with us here on World Insight on CGTN. Still to come on the program, Brett Kavanaugh has been sworn in the U.S. Supreme Court. Will this controversial appointment shape the midterm election? Welcome back. You're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The program coming to you Monday to Friday on CGTN. The U.S. Senate confirmed Judge Brett Kavanaugh to the Supreme Court after a narrow 50-48 vote. Kavanaugh has now been sworn in as an associate justice. He could join the court as early as Tuesday. Despite weeks of tension over Kavanaugh's nomination, including several sexual assault allegations lodged against him, the Democrats didn't get enough votes to stop his nomination. President Donald Trump from the U.S. tweeted to congratulate his victory. Some analysts believe this event may cause the U.S. political balance to shift and will have a profound impact over the upcoming midterm election. Whether that is true or not, we are joined in Beijing by Inner Tangen, current affairs commentator. In Washington, D.C., we have Bruce Fein, a lawyer and former Associate Deputy Attorney General under President Reagan. And also in Washington, D.C., Steve Pruitt, managing partner at Watts Partners. He's also a former staff director of the Committee on the Budget of U.S. House of Representatives. Gentlemen, welcome to our program. Your immediate reaction, Mr. Fein, since you're closer to that job than most of us, about this confirmation, briefly.
Well, I think the confirmation has turned the midterms into a referendum on President Trump. You know, his sneering attitude and criticism of Dr. Christine Ford, who had made one of the sexual assault allegations, just reinforced his perception of a vulgar misogynist. And I think it will have an impact on the November elections, and I don't think it'll be favorable to Mr. Trump. With regard to the future of the United States Supreme Court, I think it's unfortunate that you had such what you would call a great innovation, the narrowness of a vote, which is the first time in 140 years that a nominee has been confirmed by such a narrow margin. It will tend to make the United States Supreme Court appear more as a political institution, that is an impartial arbiter. I think that's damaging to the confidence of the American people in the administration of justice. Well, and I also think that there will not be a huge, dramatic wrench in the way the Supreme Court rules. Anthony Kennedy was already conservative. There are a handful of cases, I think they're important, on executive power, where it's clear that Judge Kavanaugh, now Justice, will rule in favor of the executive branch. But those will be, episodic rather than systemic.
Mr. Pruitt, what about your judgment? Will the Supreme Court still function well, or will it become extremely conservative, as many suspect in the U.S.?
No, I think they will continue to function well, and I believe, like Bruce, that the system and the structure of the court will survive even this. Our Constitution and our institutions, I believe, are strong enough to do that. What concerns me most about the court is not the immediate impact of the Kavanaugh appointment, but the potential that will arise 20 years from now if there are additional justices appointed by President Trump that further moves the court in that direction. That will have an impact over my grandchildren and many others.
Well, Mr. Tangen, Mr. Pruitt is already thinking about 20 years from now, but given the lens that the Supreme Court judges serve, it is a rather reasonable concern. Mr. Tangen, from your perspective, you served also regionally as a lawyer in the United States. How do you see that, particularly how will different parts of the United States read that message and eventually translate into different judgments?
Well, there are a number of factors. If you're talking about this purely from political, what does Donald Trump do over this next month? I mean, he is really...
Before we talk about Donald Trump, maybe let's talk about the Supreme Court first, the 9, as they say, and the impact of the 9 to the rest of the country.
Well, the impact of the 9 to the rest of the country is rather smaller, except when you get into issues like Roe versus Wade, the right to choose for women. And this is really what...
Well, for women, that's a big issue.
That's a huge issue, and the Kavanaugh hearing put that on center stage. Now, this is something that has enraged a lot of people. Everyone has seen all the demonstrations that were on the Hill. They were pounding on the doors of the Supreme Court. This reminds me of the times of suffragettes wanting the right to vote. They are enraged. The question is, does this how does this affect the country as a whole? We're completely in division. Will this court bring it back together, or will it enhance those divisions,
right,
like Bruce and Steve said?
Of course, having said that, though, gentlemen, it is important to talk about whether this nomination and eventually Kavanaugh coming into the Supreme Court will be a significant political event regarding the upcoming midterm election. Earlier, Mr. Pruitt, your colleague, Mr. Fain, already suggesting it's going to be a referendum on Trump, but that is nothing new. I mean, a month ago, it was already a referendum on Trump, and the Democrats want to see it that way, too. So, Mr. Pruitt, what do you make of the impact of this on the upcoming midterm election, positive or negative on the current administration and the Republicans?
Well, I would concede to at least one point that my Republican friends are making, which is that this election's probably going to be closer and that there will not be an overwhelming blue wave that's going to spring across the country. That said, though, I think that in my view, it's clear that the House of Representatives is going to change control, and the question there will be by how many seats, and I have long held that it will be in the 40 to 50 range. I don't see the Senate itself changing in terms of numerical control, but I do see the mix changes. I think there are a couple of Democrats who will probably lose, unfortunately, but I also see a couple of Republican Senate seats that are also going to change. So we're still going to be pretty much at 51-49 with Republican control in the Senate. That said, the larger picture, though, presents in both houses a much more conservative-leaning government in America. And that's going to play itself out in some interesting ways, particularly as you measure conservatism against what President Trump is trying to achieve on a number of issues, and they don't mix well. So I think we're going to see some confrontations there.
Interesting. Mr. Fain, of course, midterm election, many have told me that in the United States it's about getting the so-called the middle out and get them to vote and eventually make sure that one party will have the triumph over the other party. Is that still true with this big political, apparently, event going on with Kavanaugh coming into the Supreme Court? Mr. Fain.
Well, you've obviously got to awaken your constituency with some kind of excitement and belief that things can change. I do think that the Democrats can argue that if they take control of the House, they could open impeachment proceedings against Mr. Kavanaugh for statements that seem to be equivocal repeatedly under oath during the Senate confirmation hearings before the Judiciary Committee. In fact, the person who would be chairman of the committee, Jerry Nadler, has already raised that issue. And again, in terms of the precedent here and the bitterness in which this particular battle was fought, to my mind, it's very portentous. You could have a situation where if the Democrats get control, they could try to expand the number of justices. And if they have a Democratic president, make the number of justices a political plaything and go up from 9 to 15, which was what President Roosevelt tried to do in the 1930s. So that's one of the reverberations that we're looking at to upset our constitutional system. It was St. Paul who said, "The letter killeth, but the spirit giveth life." And if you try to push radical changes on slender majorities, you're waiting for a backlash. And in fact, we already witnessed this with regard to the actual confirmation vote. It wasn't long ago when you needed 60 votes, not simple 50, in order to get a confirmation because of the filibuster rule. Well, the Democrats thought that was blocking too many of Obama nominees, so they slashed it to 50 for all but Supreme Court justices. And then Mitch McConnell comes in and says, well, if you can do it for all other judges, we're going to do it for Gorsuch. So they lowered the 60, which ensured against kind of radical change, to 50, and that's where we are now. That's one of the reasons we're confronting a divided country.
But that is exactly what we're talking about here, isn't it, Mr. Pruitt, that politics has now taken the most important role, even when it comes to the selection of judges on the Supreme Court, and which is being considered as one of the most important parts of the American government. And as you said, it's going to have a long impact, probably 20 years or even further, Mr. Pruitt. That is the thing.
Well, and I would again reiterate that point, but I would also say that The discussion we're having today is today's news, and I can guarantee you by probably the next 24 to 72 hours, we're going to be talking about something else. I mean, this administration has shown an inability to stay on message and to continue to drive certain points home, and they will continue to do that. Secondly, I think it's important to note that politically, it's probably not a wise idea for the Democrats to be talking about impeachment of anybody. Quite frankly, those of us who do lean Democratic want a whole lot of things done that government should already be doing, and wasting time, if you will, on impeachment exercises really will take the attention off the ball here, because Congress itself has shown they're not very good at multitasking. So I caution every Democrat that I talk to, whether they be in leadership or sitting on the back bench, to get focused on what you're going to do for people and worry about the politics of the court and impeachment some other time. No.
Whether in the next 48 to 72 hours people will still talk about it is one thing, but the impact of it will certainly be felt for a long time to come. Mr. Tangen, having said that, though, let me ask you also, the fact that we see one battle after another partisan going on in Washington, the question is, will these issues eventually have an impact largely when it comes to content on the midterm election? These issues that the common people really concerned about and they would vote on, Mr. Tangen.
Well, it's actually split. I mean, Donald Trump will be parading around that he's kept his promises, that the economy is going great, and that he deserves all the credit for that. The Democrats on their side will be, of course, saying, look, you know, he's politicized the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
He is not very presidential, and they will be pushing that. But one thing that we should all be aware of, this next election is very, very important for one particular reason. These state legislatures will be doing the reapportionment, and that means that they will be deciding the districts that are going to be making up these congressional districts. And having that power, if they're Democrats, could help them out a tremendous deal. Last time it was Republicans in most across the board, and they were very able to gerrymander what they wanted, and that's part of what has led to this kind of partisan divide. Remember, Donald Trump did not get the popular vote, but he was able to manage it.
Having said that, though, another detail we have to mention, Mr. Pruitt, to you, that is, during the hearing, Mr. Kavanaugh, the way he carried himself, probably got more concerned than what exactly have been the accusations against him. And therefore, a sacred part of the government, such as the Supreme Court, at least long concerned in that way by many others around the world, now become quite an interesting body which is combining so many different kinds of personalities. What would that mean for the, in a way, the trust people have about the Supreme Court, if we're not talking about politics anymore?
Well, they are going to either earn or lose their trust based upon the decisions that they make. It's interesting, Bruce and I were having a similar discussion about the hearing before this segment, and I think both of us agree that we would have preferred that Justice just admit that when he was young he did crazy things like all the rest of us did, but that he's a grown man now. There's plenty to be said for youthful exuberance, but that he's a grown man now and he sees things differently. That said, I think it's important to note that, again, the decisions they will make as soon as this session of the Supreme Court will kind of lay the true foundation of how they will be perceived going forward. And the good news, I guess, is the Supreme Court doesn't really at least take that many cases that are publicly decided and covered in the media. There are a number that get decided throughout the process. But I think hopefully this term there won't be that many big public cases decided. Maybe Bruce has a better sense of that. But if that's the case, then I think the foundation will be laid.
Mr. Feng, I have to go to you with the introduction by your colleague, Mr. Puig. So what about the credibility of the Supreme Court now, particularly when it comes to the qualities of the individual judges?
Well, of course, it's put under a cloud. I think there were literally scores of occasions where Judge Kavanaugh was equivocating. It was obvious to anybody who was watching to see the body language, the tone of voice, or otherwise. And justice requires the appearance of justice, and certainly Judge Kavanaugh, now Justice Kavanaugh, is going to detract from that image. Now, with regard to other elements here, because he's on the bench, I'm a litigant, and I will now, if I have a conservative cause, I will create the case that goes to the Supreme Court because I'm more confident with a fifth vote in my favor. So even if the docket now, which was created when Justice Kennedy was on the bench, looks rather innocuous, I can guarantee you it's going to change with regard to the activists who look to the court as some place where they can litigate their public policy preferences and will generate litigation. I can't resist, however, adding a point about impeachment. We tried that, and the Democrats did in 2006. Nancy Pelosi said to all the world and Mr. President George Bush and Dick Cheney, impeachment's off the table. Then we got presidential wars. We got presidential engagements instead of treaties. We got presidents playing judge, jury, prosecutor to kill American citizens without any due process.
Yeah.
We got surveillance on the entire American people. So if you take impeachment off the table, even if it's politically advantageous at that time, it's the ruination of the rule of law.
Well, fascinating discussion, I have to say, gentlemen. Thank you so much for sharing with us your insights and your observations. Einar Tangen, Bruce Feng, Steve Pruitt, thank you so much for being with us. Really appreciate it. And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us, World Insight CGTN, into your search engine, or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching. Tune in again next time for insights across China and around the world. Good night.